Okay, so this morning we're going to have an interesting conversation on risk reward index. And we have Zainab Animashaun. I hope I got it right. Senior Analyst Control Risks based in Nigeria. Yeah. Good morning, Zainab.
Good morning, Nanaya. I hope I got that correctly.
Yes,
Good
and I hope I
morning,
also got yours. Pronounce your name again.
It's Zainab. It's Zainab.
Zainab,
No, the other one.
there's a surname, the other one.
The surname is Animashaun.
Animashaun.
Animashaun. Okay, okay.
Wow.
So
Yeah,
welcome
right.
to the show here this morning on Metro TV in Ghana, and quite an interesting one that we're going to be talking about. First off, can you just give us a background story to what really the risk reward index is for those of us who are hearing this for the first time?
Yeah.
Well, thank you again for having me. It's such a pleasure joining you on this morning. So the risk reward index really is an annual report that my firm Control Risk, which is a specialist risk consulting firm that works across the African continent, in partnership with Oxford Economics Africa, which specializes in political and macroeconomic research in Africa, have come together to author. So the reward index for this year is the seventh edition. And what we do each year is really just look at the investment landscape in major African markets, including Ghana, and provide a longer term outlook of what the key trends are shaping investments within these countries. So what we then look at, assigning risk and reward scores to each country. So for example, this year we saw improvements in reward scores, which look at, the economic potential of countries like Mozambique, Angola, Senegal. These countries did very well because they saw a lot of improvements in their oil sector. On the risk side, we saw countries like Cote d'Ivoire improve, because they've made a lot of impact in terms of national reconciliation. With Ghana, unfortunately, we saw lower rewards due to the country's current economic constraints, which we'll probably have a chat about during this conversation. And that really has resulted in the government's ongoing bailout discussions with the IMF. We also saw, a lot of rising risk because of political discontent. We're seeing a lot of protests in Ghana by Ghanaian citizens and their frustrations with recent economic challenges. So we essentially just take a look at what the political and economic dynamics are in each country, and we assign scores to it. And that gives like a big picture of what's going on across the continent every year.
Okay, so with this report, what should the government of Ghana, policy makers, investors, what should they be looking forward to in the coming year?
I think the core recommendation in the reward is that, investors looking to do business in Ghana and anywhere else on the continent really should be aware of what the current, dynamics are in each country, and not let that deter them, but, think through innovative ways, to navigate those markets. It would be useful for the key stakeholders you mentioned, to look, for example, at, how other African countries have dealt with, external shocks that we've all dealt with over the last 2 years. So COVID and the ongoing Ukraine conflict, which has impacted practically every country in the world. It's not peculiar to Ghana or any other country, So just understanding what each country has done to deal with these issues, how they've responded to it, and ways in which they can also support the government to, deliver solutions and recover from that, and potentially get solutions and opportunities from that through their businesses. Essentially, those are the main things that we think, investors and government agencies should look at when they're looking at the report.
Okay, Zainab, let's talk about the risk reward index theme for this year. Opportunities through uncertainties. Why that particular theme?
So we chose this theme because I think the key message that resonates in this year's risk reward index is that despite the global uncertainty that we've seen, not only across Africa, but across the world, the African continent still continues to present huge investment value. We're talking about a continent with over 1.4 billion citizens across 55 countries, which are, making efforts to become increasingly integrated through initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and so there's still so many opportunities for investors, if they're able to successfully navigate the political and economic complexities in each country. And that's why we chose, the theme opportunity through uncertainty.
Okay, so according to the report, the after effects of COVID-19, Russia-Ukraine war, I mean, these things have impacted the African economy. What are some of the key outstanding risks that Ghana faces and other African countries as well?
So we highlighted three outstanding trends in this year's report. We had highlighted one, the uncertainty around energy diversification. We highlighted rising food insecurity, and we highlighted, the groundswell of political discontents that we're seeing in Ghana and other parts of Africa. So with energy diversification, with Ghana, for example, we're seeing Ghana and other countries struggle to adjust to the impact of the supply chain disruptions triggered by the Ukraine conflict. So on one hand, we've seen a lot of, record crude oil prices, which is good for Ghana because it's a major oil exporter. But on the other hand, we're also seeing increased importation costs for refined petroleum, which Ghana spent about $669 million, importing in 2020 alone. So we're seeing increased prices, of petrol on the streets. In Ghana, we're seeing increased prices of, construction because, Ghana relies on countries like Ukraine to import, iron ore and steel. Around 60%, of that was sourced from Ukraine in 2021. In terms of food security, we've seen Ghana and indeed the rest of Africa face food supply challenges, that have worsened over the last 2 years because of COVID, and now the Ukraine conflict. Ghana, for example, imported around 29% of its wheat from Russia. It also imports fertilizers and other grains. And now these, sustained shocks have exposed not just Ghana, but the rest of Africa's reliance on food imports. And this is what has triggered, increases in consumer prices, which we're now seeing, in the inflation, hikes that we've seen over the last 1 year, not just in Ghana, but across the continent. We're seeing Zimbabwe, for example, has gone up to around 280% inflation this year alone. That's the highest in the world, and so it's really triggered by, our reliance on importation of food as opposed to local production. Now, this then led to the third, trend that we're seeing, which is political discontent. And I'm sure you're familiar with that in Ghana. The rise in commodity prices have now triggered a cost of living crisis. So we're seeing higher cost of food, housing, transport, water, electricity, and with the fact that, the Ghanaian government is currently, facing a lot of high public debt. Bank of Ghana says, there's around 78% debt to GDP. It's then struggling to, address the rising cost of living. And this is what has triggered what we're seeing on the streets of Ghana, the citizen protests that we're seeing, everything from Fix the Country, the Yentua demonstrations that we saw, against the very unpopular e-levy earlier in the year, and the Arise Ghana protests, which turned, violent in June. And so these are the three main risks that we're monitoring that we've seen not just in Ghana, but across, other African countries this year. And we highlighted that in the report.
Okay, so now let's talk about poverty, but we're talking energy poverty. Africa is planning to host a very huge, the largest energy meeting. How should we, or what should we be picking from that, and how should we prepare ourselves as African countries to take the advantage of the energy resources that we find around ourselves?
Well, with energy poverty, it is a major challenge for African countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where around 2/3 of the, the population are believed to lack access to energy. So each country we're seeing is working to address its own, peculiar energy access issues. A lot of countries are relying on, hydropower, thermal power, and most of these are really expensive. They require lots of infrastructure investments, and there's a lot of inefficiencies in state management. And I know, in Ghana, for example, we had the Domso power, supply crisis in the mid-2010s, and that was really triggered, by most of these issues. So a lot of countries, including Ghana, are looking for alternative homegrown solutions to, to address these issues. So wind power, power, solar power, biofuel energy sources. And this creates, a huge opportunity for investors to come in and partner with the government. And it's also attracted a lot of, significant attention from development finance institutions like the World Bank, and the African Development Bank. Now with Ghana, the level of commitment that the government would have would depend on availability of public funds, and, what the demand levels are for uptake. So for example, we've seen President Nana Akufo-Addo's government stall, a lot of multi-million-dollar take-or-pay electricity and gas supply contracts over the years that were executed by previous administration, mainly because the government just doesn't have enough funds to pay for that, and also because there's just not enough local demand, for all the power that will be produced. So in terms of opportunities, businesses that are able to come into Ghana and propose cheaper, more affordable infrastructure to address energy, access challenges would be the most likely to benefit immensely from the market.
Okay, that's great.
Okay, then before you leave, what recommendation will you give to Ghana and also Africa at large on how to foster or grow their economy, irrespective of everything that is happening around the world?
I think one key recommendation I would give, from the report is that, economic recovery and growth is not something that can be done in isolation. You need to open up to partnerships, from both local and international business, private sector investors. You need to allow them to come into the country, even while you're dealing with, difficult, economic constraints. The country must remain open for business. You must put together the right economic strategies that can attract, investors to come into the country. Ghana has, fantastic opportunities in energy, natural resources, agriculture, tourism. The government must then keep these sectors open and attractive, to investors, so that they can come in and continue to invest while they address the economic challenges.
Okay. So I know we've been talking about Ghana. Let's talk about Nigeria, a country that has a lot of resources, a lot of oil money,
yes,
but the reflection isn't really there. I mean, going into 2023, the election's coming up in a bit.
Yeah.
So what should people be looking out for, especially the ordinary citizens? How are things going to pan out for them?
Well, I mean, with Nigeria, there are quite, there's always been, the uncertainty around political transitions. I'm sure you're aware we've had, about 20 years of uninterrupted democratic rule. And, in 2023, we go back to the polls to elect a new leader. What we are seeing is a three-horse race. We're seeing, a younger candidate who was part of the political establishment before Peter Obi going against, established veterans, Bola Tinubu and Atiku Abubakar. In terms of political stability, at this point, it's really anyone's guess who would win. But what is important is that, we are able to have free and fair elections, and the country, remains open and attractive to investors who are always looking, the biggest attraction for Nigeria, and we highlighted that in the risk reward report, is its market. It has over 200 million citizens, and then proximities to regional markets like Ghana, which has a fantastic tourism sector, Benin Republic and other countries across the West African region. And so it's important, to address issues around security, around infrastructure, and also around the economy, because just like Ghana, Nigeria has faced a lot of the, sustained economic shocks, from COVID and even the ongoing Ukraine conflict. And so those are the key issues that I think, investors would be looking for the next, set of leaders to address. And hopefully, I would be able to come back to give you some feedback after the elections next year, about how that went and some positive news from that.
Okay, thank you so much, Zainab. But whenever you're in Ghana, come and eat proper jollof.
I have tried Ghanaian jollof, and I might lose my passport, but it was very delicious.
Thank you very much.
So, yeah. Thank you for accepting that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for speaking to us this morning here on Metro Television. So that was Zainab Animashaun from Nigeria. We're talking about risk index, a report that came out about African countries and how we can control our risks and all of that. It was a good one. So, Nana, we're going to take a break.
Yeah, we'll take a break. There's more. Just stay tuned.